Here's the problem, that historically in this society, black folk have not moved one iota than where they were in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. In a comparative proportional term, black people are exactly where they were on the eve of the Civil War. And the eve of the Civil War, at that particular time, we had approximately 300,000 black people that were free in this country, or quasi-free, having come out of slavery. And that was out of 5 million black folk. And that 300,000 black people had mysteriously and miraculously accomplished and acquired one half of 1% of this nation's wealth. Now here you are 150 years later, and black people still only have and own 1/2 of 1% of the nation's wealth after 150 years. Also on the Civil War, eve 1860, we had black people right all over the country. That 300,000 spread out, that was so quasi-free. I looked at the employment rolls. Almost 100% of all those blacks were working in someone's house, someone's plantation, enriching and providing comfort for them. Here we are, 150 years later. 67% to 69% of all black people in America are working in some level of government. Another 26 or so% of that, 27% is working in white corporations. Only 2% of the blacks in America are working in their own community for their own people. The unemployment rate in America for black folk is over 50%. When you hear them talking about the unemployment rate in America, they're talking about two things: those individuals who are looking for jobs or those who are collecting unemployment compensation. We have an institutionalized bunch of blacks in America that are no longer in the workforce. That's why 5 years ago, when Obama was running for office, they were talking about the unemployment rate in America for 16%. At that time, the national unemployment rate for black folk was 35%. It was 48% in Detroit, Michigan, 48% in Baltimore, 49% in Pittsburgh, 52% in New York, 88% for black youth. Now, what does that mean for you in terms? There's only 3 things that any given individual can do to earn a living in our society. They either work up here and have a business, or they have a job. They don't have that, they must move down to the second level. When you move down to the second level, you must go on welfare or food stamps or some kind of public assistance. If conservatives come along and knock you off of that, you must go to the third level. You must steal, go into crime. Every individual must either work, go on welfare, or steal. An elaboration, a combination, or sophistication of those 3 things. You can't do anything else unless you evaporate and disappear. We live in a society that don't want to understand it, don't want to play games about it, about how you're going to solve the unemployment problem. You cannot solve the unemployment problem until you go back and address the real issues. Now, what are the real issues again back in 1860? You don't own and control enough wealth. Why? Because you see, slavery did not happen to black folk by accident. It was inflicted on them intentionally to do something. What was inflicted on blacks to do? It was intentionally inflicted on blacks to maldistribute almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, businesses, income, and controls of all levels of government. That was the point of slavery. It has never been corrected or addressed. All of a sudden, when black folk came out of slavery in 1865, how did they come out? They came out penniless, poor. No food, no animals, no land, no resources, no tools, no religion, no organization, nothing. All they were told is go out now, you're free, go out and compete. Compete with what? Compete with what? They said, well, you can jump high and run faster. Black folk had nothing coming out of slavery to compete with and to play the game, because you see, slavery has systematically, socially engineered them into the lowest level of a real-life monopoly game. And see, prior to the end of the Civil War, the greatest wealth builder in this nation was the back of a slave. That's what built the wealth of the society. Wall Street was set up and established and regulated off of the price and the value of a slave. Cotton prices, indigo prices, tobacco prices all followed the value of a slave. When slavery ended, the whole process shifted to the back of a slave. At the end of slavery, it shifted to Wall Street. And those became commodities then. And when the wealth building in this nation shifted from the back of a slave to Wall Street, they set up a new game. It was called monopoly. Now, and what black folk have been systematically lured into is a real-life monopoly game. Now, the monopoly game is based on some primary concepts. One is that you must be able to all sit down at the table, and everybody's supposed to get a fair share of the money. Once you get a fair share of the money, then you got a right to go around the table and try to buy land. But you want to buy the most valuable land and the best location of the land. Or you take your money and you buy basic businesses in the monopoly game, like the water company, electric company, and the railroad line. But you see, when black folk, when they got out of slavery, they did not get their 40 acres and a mule, nor the $100. And see, the Republican, radical Republicans, the liberals in the Republican Party at that time, said, that was Benjamin, Thaddeus Stevens, and Sumter said on the floor of the United States Congress, that there's only going to be one thing that black folk will ever be in America. They're either going to be slaves or they're going to be free. But they cannot be free unless minimally they have 40 acres, a mule, and $100. But they didn't get it. But by then they were trapped into a real life monopoly game. So now what blacks are doing are going around the real life board, trying to play real life monopoly with no money, no wealth. And all they do is go around the board and hope they land on free park or income tax refund. And if you play that way, sooner or later playing that real life game, you're going to land what? On the wrong person's property, and you're either going to go to jail or go broke and get out of the game. And that's why black folk right now are making a major impact on the prison system, the criminal system in this country. Because I looked around in 1860, for instance, I looked at all the major cities in the United States. And that's like Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Brook. Guess what? Even though you had less than 300,000 black people that were free or quasi-free, black people made up over 51% of all the prisoners. 51% of all the prisoners, and out of 5 million, only 300,000 of you were even free. And here we are, 150 years later, and guess what? You still make up over 51% of the prisoners. So when I hear all my civil rights leaders and all my civil rights friends, I don't care what it's Al, Jesse, keep talking about, we've come a long way. You haven't gone any place. And quit BSing people and bamboozling people and black folk about how far we've come. You haven't come any place. You're still sitting in the same identical spot. As my mother would say, you haven't got a pot or one to throw it out of. That's why our dilemma. We do not have any wealth. Now, I indicated to you a few minutes ago that the whole process of slavery maldistributed almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, privileges, and controls of all levels of government into the hands of the dominant white society. Now, what does that mean in tangible terms? That when you only got 1/2 or 1% of the wealth, how can you compete with 1/2 or 1% of the wealth? When in this society right now, today, 150 years later, the average white person in America as a group got 3,500 times more money than the average black person. The average white has 3,500 times more money than the average black. I got 2 whites right now, some of them I know, they got more wealth than all 42 million black people put together. How, if 2 white men got more wealth than all 42 million black folk put together, what kind of game are you playing? What are you going to do? How can you compete? As a matter of fact, let me move it off to men. Let's move it to gender. For every dollar that a black woman has to run a household, the white woman has $100 to run a household. You're supposed to have enough money to be able to be self-sufficient. And this is true all around the world. Not just with blacks in this country. If I were to look at you got approximately 25 to 26% of the population is black around the earth. And you got over $300 trillion in wealth on the earth. And out of that $300 trillion, if I take all the African countries, the Caribbean countries, and Latin America, put them together, you still have 1/2 or 1% of the wealth out of 300 trillion. I go down to South Africa, and I've spoken in all these countries, and I've had trade missions in Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Bermuda, Barbados, all these, Venezuela, Colombia. I've been to all these countries, head of trade missions, representing presidents and governors. You can't compete in South Africa. In South Africa, with something like about 29 million blacks as an example, as a comparative example. 29 million blacks in South Africa. You got a little over 2 million whites. But guess what? They own almost 100% of all the wealth in Africa. The 2 million whites. As a matter of fact, in Africa, The De Beers family, one white family, the De Beers family, owns over 50% of the whole wealth of Africa. That means all the gold, silver, chrome, bauxite, magnesium, land, property, everything. And you want to know why they can't make it in Africa? They don't own and control anything. And so in America, if we're going to be a competitive group, we got to go back to what is the basic problem we can deal with. The biggest problem with blacks right now, they own no wealth. They control absolutely nothing. Not in the United States, not in Grand Rapids. I don't have to go around Grand Rapids to find what you got. I can guarantee you right now what you have and don't have. Or when you go into any city, you figure out who owns the buildings, the big buildings, who owns the communication system, who owns the banks, who owns the railroads, the bus companies. That's where your power is. If you don't control a sufficient amount of that, you are a guest, G-U-E-S-T. You have no power. They can do anything they want anytime you want them. So black folk don't have enough wealth to be a competitive group. You cannot compete. That's the first problem. Now that you know what the problem is. The problem is a lack of wealth. And I'm going to get later on, I'm going to tell you how blacks should start getting wealth. Now, what's the second problem? The second problem is you got impediments that have consistently been used and imposed on black folk to make sure they don't get any wealth. Not necessarily by whites. But what you have in this society, we have a public policy that went into effect in 1867. When the 15th Amendment was enacted. The 15th Amendment says black people can now run for a public office. You can now run for office, but they said you can run for office to be for a sheriff's office, a postal office, or you can even run for Congress or a state legislator. But if you run for a public office or get into the public arena, there are some taboos that you cannot do. One, you cannot run for a public office as a black person and talk about black issues. Point one. Point two, you cannot come in a public office and talk about groupism. You must always talk about individualism, individual achievement. And point three, you cannot come into a public office and try to hold the dominant white society accountable for slavery and what they've done to you for 500 years through Jim Crow segregation and slavery. That means you can't have reparations. Now, if any of you try to do it, you'll be charged with racism or reverse racism. But nobody ever admits you cannot have a reverse racism unless you got a forward racism. And they don't understand what racism is. So when we start talking in a few minutes about solutions, understand clearly that it is impossible in theory and practice for a black person to be a racist. It is totally, absolutely impossible. When I listen to the Fox channel, I say, you can't be that stupid and go to college unless you're using Gorilla Glue and got a certificate for being stupid. You cannot have a black person as a racist. All black people can do is react to racism. They're not racist. Racism is a power concept, point one, and two, it's a group concept. To be able to be a racist, you must belong to the group that has the power and the wealth. And it's a group-based concept. I'm gonna divert over for a second just to give you a little piece of information. Racism never existed on the earth until the 1500s. The same time capitalism came into effect, and we'll talk about that also. Racism never existed. During the 1400s, European societies were devastated with crime, poverty, and diseases. And when Columbus came back and he discovered America, at that point in time, 9 European nations said, let's now go and enrich ourselves in that third world country. And they decided then, based on slaves that had been brought to Henry the Navigator back in 1443 and given to him, they said, and the Pope then put out a public edict in 1488 saying, if you're going to slave anybody, use what we've learned through the Catholic Church, these black slaves that Henry the Navigator gave us, use them. And so everybody started going around the coast of Africa and picked up these blacks. And they were picking up these black people off the coast of Africa for about $25 a head. And they were bringing them to the New World and selling them for a $1,500 return on investment. And then prior to that time, the major form of commerce was called mercantilism. By 1509, it switched off, they started calling it capitalism. Now, this is very important for you all to start learning if you're going to do something in this city. Capitalism, in the simplest definition, in the 1500s, it says learning, acquiring, own, and control the land, the tools, the resources, and use other people's labor to enrich yourself. That's what capitalism is. I'm going to tell it to you again. It means learn how to acquire and control and own the land, the resources and tools, and use other people's labor to enrich yourself. That's capitalism. Now, W.D. Du Bois defined it a little different in 1915. He said that capitalism is like having 3 to 4 ears of corn. You eat one, you save one, you sell one, and you save the seeds for next year's planting. That's capitalism. Now, in neither of those definitions did any of y'all hear me, and correct me if you heard it. I didn't mention anything about civil rights and social integration. I said it's learning how to acquire wealth, tools, resources, and enrich yourself off of it. But what has happened now in the black community is through impediments is that we've been bamboozled by a lot of the black leadership in this country to having black folk focus strictly on civil rights and social integration. Social integration has failed in this country for black folk. It's the worst thing that ever happened to black folk. Black folk went backwards with social integration. What black folk lost almost everything they had during the process of social integration. Before integration came, and most of my white friends, and again when I say white friends, see I got white relatives, y'all might not know that. And see they jump on me all the time, but you gotta quit saying those things about us. We're not part of that. But I got half my family want to pass a white, I go on fine, do it. But see, but social integration is a diluting process, it's a watering down process. And before integration, black people in America had their own businesses. They had their own communities. They had their own schools and churches. As a matter of fact, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I grew up, my family was one of the families that was a part owner of a 4-family operation. We own the only black bus line in America, the only one they've ever had. When I say a bus line, I'm not talking about 3 or 4 buses or 10 or 15 buses. We had over 500 buses. We didn't service just the black neighborhood. We serviced the white neighborhoods too. It was called a Safe Bus Company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We took care of the city bus services. In Winston-Salem, the black community also had 2 cab companies. Why? Because the white community had 2 cab companies. The white community had the Bluebird and the Yellow cabs. Blacks, we had the Harris cab and the Kansas City cabs. We had our own movie theaters, the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. They had theirs, the Hollywood, the North Carolina theaters, the state theaters. We had our own restaurants and shoe shops and clothing stores and everything. We lost all of that. We even had our own movie theaters. We had the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. In every city in the United States, blacks had the 2 movie theaters, the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. We had movie producing studios, Norman Productions down in Jacksonville, Florida, Rishaw in Chicago, and Hollywood Productions making our own movies. They weren't the best movies, but they were ours. But see, when integration came, it took away everything from us. And unfortunately, it wasn't because it was conspiracy of whites to do that. It wasn't the whites that did that. It was the NAACP. Now, don't go blaming whites for that. Whites didn't jump up this idea about let's go out and force blacks into integration. You see, when down in McLaren, South Carolina, where I used to live, in McLaren, South Carolina, they filed an original lawsuit, became the desegregation decision in 1954. They weren't filing for social integration. They filed it because the black kids were walking to school every day and the white kids were riding on buses. And in my school, in elementary school, we had to spend the first week every year of school cleaning up the old books. The white schools would send all the old books over to our school. We had to clean them and fix them up, take gum, erase them, get all the dirt and trash off and put tape on them. We got all their hand-me-downs of everything, for equipment, tools, everything. And so when Clinton, South Carolina filed a lawsuit, they filed it based on what? Money, economics. They're saying it's not right. They've been talking about social integration. The city and the state county was paying what? $1 for every black child to go to school and $11 for every white child to go to school.